My talk today is entitled Approaches to Reduce Southern Yellow Pine Plantation Reforestation Cost. In Mississippi, there's 4 main southern yellow pine species: slash, shortleaf, longleaf, loblolly, and then some spruce. And loblolly pine plantations dominate from an acreage perspective, but particularly from a value perspective. And loblolly natural is important, and there's some other plantations. And of course, the longleaf restoration is becoming a more and more important issue through time. But nonetheless, loblolly pine plantations are fairly dominant. So this talk is going to concentrate a lot on loblolly pine, but it also relates to longleaf, shortleaf, and slash. And some of it, of course, also relates to some hardwood aspects as well. The 4 main species, longleaf pine was dominant in southern Mississippi actually prior to active fire suppression beginning in the early 1900s, and of course through land conversion as well as the initial cutover that were replanted the loblolly and slash because they were generally faster growing and easier to regenerate. And then slash is confined to the south, and then loblolly and shortleaf were found throughout the entire state with the exception of the Delta region, most likely in large part because of the soils. And shortleaf actually was a lot more prominent than it is now as well, similar to longleaf, and it is a fire-dependent ecosystem as well, similar to longleaf, and so it also got hurt by the exclusion of fire. And here's Scott County for this talk today, and you can see how this kind of relates largely into loblolly, but longleaf's right on the northern edge of longleaf. There are many advantages to planting. Better control of stocking, particularly at younger ages. Sometimes when you naturally generate, where you rely on the cones from the site. So either from the trees on the site, such as through seed tree and shelterwood, or through the adjacent trees. And sometimes you can have an excessive amount of natural regeneration, sometimes like 10,000 seedlings per acre. Well, you have to come through and thin that out, and that's pre-commercial. So therefore, you're not going to get any value on that thinning, and as a matter of fact, you're going to have to pay for that thinning. There is very good control over genetics and consistent spacing throughout the stand, right? When I plant seedlings, I'm sowing seed at some other place, a nursery, growing the seedlings there 1 year in the nursery, and then I'm bringing them to my site. Well, obviously, you can imagine I have very good control over the genetics. Mass Control-Pollinated, full SYP or half SYP, Open-Pollinated. Is it Atlantic Coastal Plain source? Is it Mississippi source? East Texas source, etc. Earlier financial returns, often because of faster growth rates, because we also generally do better site preparation and vegetation control. More straightforward to conduct species conversion. Remember, the seed natural relies on the seed from either the trees on the site or the adjacent sites. Well, if I want to grow longleaf on my property and I have no longleaf on my site and I have no longleaf on adjacent properties, it's going to be very hard to have longleaf regenerate. So therefore, I'm going to have to bring seedlings from somewhere else. As I said, often growth rates are faster, so you get an earlier financial return. I don't need to rely on seed years, bumper crops, because once again, I'm not relying on the trees themselves. I'm bringing seedlings from somewhere else. And there's usually a single clear cut. That's generally better. Fewer visits on my property by the logger. I only have 1 harvest, like a seed tree sometimes can have 2. Shelterwood can even have 3. I should say seed tree has 2. Shelterwood has 2 and sometimes can have 3. So there are advantages to planting. Now there are some disadvantages. Higher regeneration costs. I'm paying for the seedlings. I'm putting the seedlings into the ground. Generally, right, we're doing more intensive site prep than with natural. Can be some problems with J rooting and L rooting if I don't have the planting depth right when I'm planting. Can be unaesthetically pleasing because these species, all 4 major pine species, are fairly heavy, intolerant to shade. Therefore, they're basically going to have clear cuts to regenerate. And therefore, this can be problematic visually. Often I'm going to have heavy equipment on my site for site preparation. So today, then, we're going to talk about approaches to reduce reforestation costs. And these are going to be the topics we're going to cover. I'm not going to talk to a great extent about cost shares, but they are certainly there at state, federal, and then there are some private organizations, I believe, for longleaf, like Longleaf Alliance, and there's some other private, I believe, for longleaf. Federal reforestation tax and state, Mississippi Reforestation Tax Credit, cost share exclusions, and then lowering the planting density, configuration, and and genetic type, Bareroot container. That's what we're going to talk about today. So I can, by reducing the planting density, reduce my reforestation cost. If I'm planting fewer seedlings per acre, which is then the number of seedlings that I'm planting per acre. If I'm planting 303 versus 605, well, I have to purchase about half the number of seedlings. Therefore, that should definitely reduce my reforestation cost. I have to plant about half the seedlings, so that should reduce my reforestation cost. Yeah, definitely by hand, but even with machine, if I'm doing machine planting, I'm probably going to have fewer rows when I'm planting with 303 or lower density compared to a higher density, so therefore I should reduce my cost. And any activity, particularly like site preparation, mechanical, and banded herbicide applications. So we're generally going to plant from December to March, and then February to May, depending on when you planted, you're going to come over the top, usually with a banded herbicide application. And so anything that depends on the number of passes, if I'm planting fewer seedlings per acre and I have fewer rows, well, then I have fewer passes, fewer beds, fewer rips. And you can see that here. This is 16 feet between rows and then 6 feet within a row versus 6 feet between rows and 6 feet within a row. Now this is much higher than we're going to plant today. I would say most people at most plant 700 seedlings per acre anymore. But nonetheless, this gives you visually shows you the advantages of lower planting density. I'm definitely going to reduce the number of rows. If I'm bedding, all right, I'm going to reduce the number of passes. I should reduce my labor costs, my fuel costs. I should have potentially less erosion, maybe less compaction from that heavy equipment, fewer passes on my property. Banded herbicide application, as I said, we plant generally from December to March, and then February to May, we're going to come over the top of the seedling. So once again, right, if I take out every other row here, I should put out less chemical, should use less fuel in this four-wheeler or the tractor, and environmentally could be beneficial in putting out less chemical if I'm planting fewer seedlings per acre and I'm putting out fewer rows. Beyond that, I can gain advantages from understory vegetation production. I can delay the time to crown closure when I plant lower densities. Plus, I can benefit from keeping my tree vigor higher for an extended period of time. Therefore, I can extend the time to the need for the first thinning, to reopen that stand up for more light for the understory vegetation, as well as to keep the tree vigor high in relation to Ips and southern pine beetle, as we saw in 2023. And then this could be advantageous during the first thinning, and I'll show that here in just a second. Wider spacings between rows. So here is crown closure, and you can see there's hardly any light getting to the understory vegetation, and there's hardly any understory vegetation, whether woody or herbaceous. So I'm going to have to thin that stand. But if I can delay the time to this crown closure by planting a lower density, planting fewer rows, I can then extend my time where I have a greater understory vegetation production. This is basal area per acre. Basal area is the amount of cross-sectional area at 4.5 feet above the ground. You can imagine as basal area increases, that's going to increase the amount of competition for light, moisture, nutrients to the understory vegetation. And here we see age with crown closure. Here's a lower planting density, and here's a higher planting density. You can see that higher planting density, I'm already getting to this state by about age 6 to 8. If I plant a lower density, eventually, right, if I'm planting anywhere probably from 200 seedlings per acre to 300 seedlings per acre, I'm eventually going to get crown closure, no matter what density I plant. But I can extend the period to that crown closure. I can extend the period of this higher vegetation, and I can extend the period of the more vigorous trees, which can help me against, say, like southern pine beetle and Ips, particularly if I can't get a first thinning, or if I can't even thin on my property. Another advantage is when I plant lower densities, I can get earlier production of more valuable saw logs and chip and saw, and I can get more of it through time. And so here is the second quarter 2024 pine stumpage prices. Statewide, $1.69 for pulpwood, $10.64 for chip and saw, and $19.60 for saw timber. Well, this is what, about 9 to 10 times more for pine pulpwood, about 5 to 6 times more for chip and saw. 2,000 pounds is 2,000 pounds. If I have a ton of saw timber, it's the same weight as a ton of pulpwood. The characteristics of that ton make that ton of saw timber 10 times more valuable than the pine pulpwood. Therefore, I don't want to be growing pine pulpwood trees. I want to be growing chip and saw, and really even traditionally the chip and saw markets are pretty bad today, and even the saw timber are pretty bad. I'd like to get in the poles if I could, right? But with loblolly I don't have maybe the amount that I have with longleaf. But nonetheless, even though the markets are still poor in pine saw timber, I'd rather be here than over here. And so therefore, by reducing the planting density, I can get to that time where I'm initiating saw timber and chipping saw, and I can get a greater amount through time. Here's an extremely high planting density, things that we don't plant anymore. Here's 681, more of what we're going to plant, maybe the extreme today. But you can see that basically by age 25, I have no saw timber in that high planting density. And I'm already up here. So I'm basically growing pulpwood trees, a lot of pulpwood trees here, and that's not where I want to be. And I get reduced reforestation costs. I get more understory vegetation production for an extended length of time. I can delay the time to first thinning to get more into my more valuable chip and saw, say, as well as to keep tree vigor high for pine beetles. So there's some advantages to planting lower density. Now let's talk about configuration. Traditionally, a lot of times we planted square, so the same distance between rows as within a row when we planted the seedlings. Now we're planting more rectangular, greater distance between rows relative to the distance within a row. Here's 1.5 and here's 2.67. Well, think about how much longer this is going to take to get crown closure relative to this and relative to that. I can extend that period of understory vegetation production, how much light is getting there, how much more nutrients and moisture are available to the understory for an extended period of time. I might be able to keep my tree vigor high. There's some thought that by these rectangular spacings, I can help with the wind to come through that may reduce the pheromone, the strength of the pheromones for the Ips and southern pine beetle. So there are advantages then, no doubt, to rectangular spacing. Once again, number of passes. If I'm planting more rectangular and lower planting density, I have fewer passes. Can benefit on the bedding and ripping. Can I reduce the seedling planting cost? Well, perhaps if I have fewer rows. Once I get into a row with a machine or hand, I can just go along, right? If I'm planting fewer rows but more seedlings within a row, once I'm on that row, I can go pretty fast. So I might be able to reduce my cost. What I mean, I should say, everybody, this is the same planting density. Okay, same planting density, just different configurations. So here we can see that here. Same planting density, 454 seedlings per acre. 16 feet between, 6 feet within, 12 feet between, 8 feet within. So I'm reducing the number of passes here, same planting density. So I should reduce if I'm bedding or ripping, I should reduce my first year herbaceous weed control. So I should reduce my reforestation cost. Could be beneficial for understory vegetation for a longer period of time as well. Then the question becomes, well, what about growth and yield? Well, we've generally found that around 2-to-1 ratios, 2-to-1 and many times 3-to-1, really does not impact growth and yield enough to. So you're basically going to get about the same growth and yield, the same revenues, but reduced reforestation costs. And here's an example of ripping where you put this shank into the ground. This is an old field or pasture. You've had compaction over the years. Therefore, you got to open up that rooting zone and break up that subsoil. Well, you can imagine when I'm taking out every other pass, I should reduce my labor, should reduce my fuel cost. May be environmentally beneficial, but maybe less erosion or so forth. Here, I may have a better access, particularly if I'm planting lower densities, fewer rows, and then I'm spacing them out more rectangular even more. I may be able to get that fellow buncher and that skidder in during that first thinning. So therefore, I don't have to do a row thinning on the first thinning. So here's 454 seedlings, 16 by 6 feet, and here's square, traditionally like we did. So we had to do a row thinning. If I want to get to this tree here, I can't get to it without what? Taking out some trees in that row. So I'm going to do a row thinning. Generally every third row, so I would keep this row, and then thin this one, keep, and then thin, or every fourth, keep, and then thin. The good thing about a row thinning is I'm taking out the bad trees. The bad thing about a row thinning is I'm taking out my good trees. What trees do I want growing into my saw log and my chip and saw? Remember, 6 times more for chip and saw, about 8 to 9 or 10 times, depending on the region here in Mississippi for saw timber relative to pulpwood. Well, I don't want my better trees at the time of my thinning, my first thinning or even second thinning, I don't want them going to the lower value product class. I want to keep them growing into the higher value product class. So if I can get away from a row thinning on the first thinning and logger select or force to mark, that can be beneficial. So once again, I can reduce my reforestation costs, maybe get more understory vegetation production, maybe help with tree vigor, relation to beetles, maybe have some advantages to the number of thinnings and the thinning type. by planting lower densities and planting in more configurations. And one other thing I should say is, if I plant at a lower density, I may just have to have a single thinning, or I may not even have to thin. Therefore, I don't need to worry as much on the markets, and I don't have to have as many contracts. I don't have to have the loggers coming out to my property as many times. Many loggers are very professional, but anytime you have a logging operation, you're opening up your property to some issue. So anything I can do to reduce the number of harvests, I think, is also a good thing. Then you have machine planting and hand planting. Machine planting, once I get along that row, I can kind of speed this up as long as that person can keep up with the wheel. So rectangular spacings may or may not necessarily reduce the cost, but generally I probably could to some extent at least. Then the hand planting, fewer rows. Once that hand planter gets in the row, they can just go along. The cost of machine versus hand kind of comes and goes as to which one's advantageous. Bareroot versus container. Here is your Bareroot, obviously, right? There's no soil, no peat vermiculite mix, no container soil around the roots, and here's your container. Container are generally going to cost more. You're going to have this container as well as peat and vermiculite mix often, and so that's going to cost a little more than growing them in the Bareroot. So Bareroot then generally are going to plant from December to March. They cost less, but they have a little less window. The container can be a little more forgiving. I may be able to go all the way out to October, but generally November to April. So they're a little more forgiving, but they're going to cost a little bit more. Now, container really aren't going to give you much benefit on the growth per se, more so on survival. If I can get either one of these to survive, they're probably, genetics is the same. They're probably going to grow the same, but generally, I would expect my container to have a little better survival. Now, if I do everything right, the Bareroot will probably survive just as well as the container. The container is a little more forgiving. So here's a Bareroot nursery. You're irrigating it, you're fertilizing it, you're top clipping, etc. Kind of heaven for the seedling. Then I lift it and I take it out to this clear cut and I'm moving it out here. Well, which one do you think these two is going to handle that transplant shock a little bit better? Well, the container. Now, once again, if Mother Nature's playing ball with us and I do everything right, I take good care of the seedlings, the Bareroot's probably going to do just as well as the container. But that container is going to give me a little bit of advantage, a little more forgiving. Beyond that, for smaller landowners, 10, 20 acres, they may have problems planting in here because the planting crews, do they want to go to 10, 20 acre sites or one 200 acre site? Well, most likely they probably want to go to that single 200 acre site. Therefore, on smaller acreages anymore, I may need to plan on an off time. Therefore, the container kind of gives me a little bit more flexibility for that. Then we'll talk about seedling type and genetics. OP, Open-Pollinated versus Mass Control-Pollinated. Beginning probably around the 50s for loblolly, Slash had some improvement. Second gen for shortleaf I've seen, and longleafs has had some improvement. But loblolly, right? Because remember, loblolly pine plantations are king. We've had quite a bit of genetic improvement, probably up into our 4th generation now. Slash is probably 2nd or 3rd. I see quite a bit of slash. But beginning probably around the 50s, we had kind of this woods run. Foresters went out and picked the best trees in terms of height growth, diameter. Phenotypically, just based on visual, not really knowing anything really about the genes per se, just phenotypically. Maybe the most fusiform rust resistant, best growing habit in terms of branching and knot size, etc. Then they brought those cones back with the seed, and then they brought them to this orchard and they bred them. They then got the seed off of that, and then they grew seedlings. Well, to me, that would be your 1st gen. Okay, then I take that 1st gen and I outplant it. I then phenotypically pick the best ones out of that 1st gen. I then take that seed back to the orchard, and I now have mate those best, and now I have my 2nd gen, and then so forth on to my 3rd and 4th gen. That's the gist of it. In the orchard, I know mom. Okay, I think of it like I know mom. Okay, but I don't know exactly dad. That's open-pollinated. I know mom. I know kind of the half sib, I think is the way to say it. But I don't know the full. I don't know dad. I have a pretty good idea who dad is, but I don't know for sure. So that's your open-pollinated. Then the mass control-pollinated, here's mom. Now I'm controlling the pollination. Now I'm bringing dad through this bag and this little injection gun. Now I'm bringing dad to mom, and now I know the full sib, I believe is the way to say it. So now I know both mom and dad, and you can imagine that's going to cost a little bit more. Now, I just wanted to quickly mention the terminology is changing a little bit. We're kind of getting away from the generations because Sometimes we're seeing some second gen OP are actually better than the Mass Control-Pollinated. This is only conceptual that your fourth gen should be better than your second gen. Just sometimes it depends. So you're getting more into this elite, select, and advanced. These are the most expensive generally are the elite. Bareroot OP going to cost around $60 to $80 per thousand. Container OP around $150 to $200. So that container might buy you on that survival and that planting window, but it's going to cost you a little bit. MCP Bareroot $150 to $275 per thousand. So that knowing dad, I guess you could say, is going to cost you a little bit relative to the OP and then MCP container. I just wanted to quickly mention here, if you're a landowner just interested in reforesting your property, you don't necessarily want to maximize timber revenues. You just want to have hunting property. You want to pass the forest onto your heirs. You want to have a recreational place. You could probably get away with Bareroot OP. And by the way, these are still pretty good seedlings, what we're planting. The nursery practices are much better than what we used to do. I don't think you need to spend MCP container in that situation. Now, if you're really looking to maximize timber revenues, and you're really looking at it as a big financial investment, you may consider the higher planting seedling. So that's one way that you can reduce your reforestation costs as well. Now we'll talk about pairing chemical site prep with early herbaceous vegetation control. Chemical site preparation is generally done, say, June to October, commonly July to September of year 0. Then we're going to plant in December to March. In summer, we're going to do the chemical site prep and then plant in the winter. The purpose of the chemical site prep was to provide access for planters. We're going to knock down that understory vegetation, the non-planted, the non-pine in this case, going to brown the vegetation if we wanted to do a site preparation burn. And it's going to reduce the transplant shock, less competition to the seedlings when I outplant, less competition for light, moisture, and nutrients. Then we're going to plant December to March. But then what about the competition to herbaceous vegetation, say February to May, depending on when you plant, December to February, or say March to May. Now, chemical site prep gains you a little bit maybe of early vegetation control, but it doesn't really give you that herbaceous vegetation control during extended into the first growing season, say beyond May into September, June, July, and August, September of year 1. Traditionally, then, we would do an over-the-top banded herbicide application. Remember the number of passes. In March to May, once again, depending on when you plant it. Now, I could potentially pair those two. That's started more commonly. Therefore, I can have reduced the number of operations on my property. I can reduce my cost. Now, maybe I can extend it to August or October rather than, say, June or July. Right? But when I tank mix, I may lose a little bit on the efficacy, say, going into May, June, July, and August, as opposed to doing the traditional first-year herbaceous weed control. So you got to weigh those two things, which one is going to be beneficial for you. So you're going to gain maybe a little bit financially by pairing them together, but you may lose a little bit on the efficacy. The other thing is, though, you're going to lose a little bit on the tax deduction. Each tax year, you can deduct up to $10,000 reforestation costs. So if I put everything into year 0, say December and earlier, well, I can only deduct $10,000 on my reforestation. But if I spread that into January and beyond, say to May, I then can get $20,000 in deduction over those 2 tax years. Here's tax year 0, right, June to December, and then tax year 1, January to May. Here's your chemical site prep, June to October. Mechanical site prep here. This is where my purpose is not just to control the vegetation, but to alter some site condition. Ripping, right? I got a lot of logging debris that I can't remove. I can sometimes do a site prep burn, right? But I got to do something mechanical. And then you have prescribed burn site prep. And then here's your first year herbaceous weed control traditionally. Well, like I said, I can pair those together back here. But I may lose a little bit of the efficacy June, July, and August when I pair them together. But you can see, too, if I move this into here, now I only get the $10,000 for the chemical site prep and first year herbaceous weed control together, particularly if I plant here. But if I keep this over here, I then get $10,000 here and $10,000 there. Those are just things that the landowner has to decide for themselves. Definitely pay attention to how your timber is being held or your timber classification. Personal use or hobby, investor, or trade or business. We want to be trade or business, but you have to pass these hours. In order to be classified as a trade or business, you have to conduct your operations like a trade or business, and that takes some effort and cost. You can get the best tax benefits, but you're also incurring quite a bit of effort. Many of you are probably going to be an investor. And you just have to have a profit mode to be an investor of business. I don't know why anybody would be personal use or hobby. You really get limited tax benefits here. If you have a management plan, and if you're planting seedlings, I don't know why you wouldn't want to qualify as an investor or trader business. So definitely pay attention to that. But here's an example of the deduction. So let's say you had 140 acres, $300 per acre, and a little bit of rounding, $42,000 in total. Well, remember, each tax year, I get to deduct $10,000. And then I amortize the rest over the next 8 tax years. So the $32,000 amortized. Now, remember I said, if I put everything into year 0, I only get to deduct the $10,000. But if I spread that out over into tax year 1, I now get the $10,000 here and the $10,000 here. Then I spread the rest of the amortization out over the next 8 tax years, depending on how it breaks down. So to me, I want that $10,000 deduction, but I also got to look at my ability, at my cost of the operations and so forth. So those are things that really the landowner's got to decide. And one other thing I wanted to mention here is sometimes we have problems getting vendors, particularly like smaller acreages, maybe like 10 to 40 acres. It may be hard to get a separate operation here and the same vendor to come out here. So that's another thing you got to consider. So all of these things are going into your consideration. Now you have the Mississippi Reforestation Tax Credit. The deduction, you get a $10,000 deduction, but the actual benefit's going to depend on your marginal tax rate. So if you're in the 22% marginal tax rate, really the $10,000 deduction is going to give you a $2,200 benefit, and so forth. Here you're losing on interest, right? Would I rather have my money today in year 0, or would I rather wait 8 tax years, or 7 years, or 6 years? Really, I'd rather have my money back as soon as I can. Remember, inflation's been pretty high, so that's reducing the buying power of this money. I'd rather have it near the time of when my reforestation. But nonetheless, on this tax credit, that's a straight up dollar to dollar. I get a up to $10,000 tax credit through the state, Mississippi Reforestation Tax Credit. That is what I want. Now, I should say that only offsets state income tax liability. So if you're retired and you have no income tax due, you really don't get much benefit from this. I've seen that many times. But nonetheless, this is one of the greatest incentives that I've seen throughout the whole country. So basically then the benefit's going to be 50% of your actual cost for approved practices, or 50% of the Mississippi Forestry Commission cost for those approved practices. But definitely take advantage of that tax credit. Then we get Section 126 cost share exclusions. My understanding is for most cost shares, if not all cost shares you're getting from the government, state and federal, as well as say private, those are going to be taxable income. That should go into your taxable income. Some of that, though, can be excluded from income through Section 126. So definitely pay attention to whether your cost share is cost share exclusion. So, for instance, the Emergency Forest Restoration Program, the EFRP, related to the pine beetle, largely IPS, infestations 2023 and 2024, that should be taxable income. So that income will probably, that cost share, even though it's reimbursable, will probably be taxable income. But by definition, it should be excluded. Much of it should be excluded from your income. So definitely pay attention to this Section 126 cost share exclusions. CRP portions of it are excluded, I believe, equip, and then the FRDP, the Mississippi cost share, should qualify as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk about mixed genetics. Just some idea of reducing reforestation costs by planting a ratio of those Bareroot container or say MCP OP. So for example, I could plant 2 rows of MCP and then 1 row of OP. And then during the first thinning, I take out the OP. That way I keep my MCP, my better quality seedlings, growing into my chip and saw and growing into my saw logs, assuming I can thin. That's a problem, right? Of course, right? So here's just an example. I plant 454 seedlings per acre. They're all elite at $250 per thousand. That's $113 per acre. Versus if I planted 2 rows of elite, okay, 2/3, and 1 row of OP, I now reduce my reforestation cost down to $86 per acre. So those are just some ideas of, once again, depending on what your objectives are as a landowner, what more wildlife habitat and hunting and passing on and just owning property versus maximizing timber production. But even if you're trying to maximize timber production, remember, those OPs are still very good seedlings. So I still may gain financially by doing something like this. Thank you.